Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. Joining us on Business Talk today is a scholar whose work is redefining how we understand human behavior and economics. We are delighted to welcome Professor Eugenio Proto. Before we get started, I would like to introduce the guest for today's episode. Professor Eugenio Proto holds the prestigious Alec Cairncross Chair of Applied Economics and Econometrics at the University of Glasgow's Adam Smith Business School, where he leads the Applied Economics cluster and co-directs the MSc in Behavioral Science. His academic home is fitting a school named after the father of economics, housing a scholar committed to reimagining how we understand economic behavior. A research fellow of Europe's three foremost economics networks, the Center for Economic Policy Research, IZA Institute of Labor Economics, and Center for Economic Studies and IFO Institute. Professor Eugenio stands at the intersection of behavioral science, experimental economics, and human psychology. His research probes a compelling question: how do intelligence, personality, and psychological well-being shape the economic decisions people make every day? His findings don't stay confined to academic journals, published widely in leading economics outlets and peer-reviewed scientific publications. Professor Proto's work has earned the attention of international newspapers and magazines, translating rigorous research into insights that resonate far beyond the lecture hall. He earned his PhD in economics from the European Centre for Advanced Research in Economics and Statistics, University Le Brussels, Belgium in 2004, laying the foundation for a career defined by intellectual curiosity and cross-disciplinary impact. Today we sit down with Professor Eugenio Proto to unpack the fascinating insights from his research, exploring how personality traits, cognitive ability, and emotional states quietly shape the economic and social decisions that define our lives. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Professor Eugenio Proto to the conversation. Professor Eugenio, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation, and thank you for your very kind introduction.
Thank you. Professor, your research treats personality traits as economic variables. How did you first make that intellectual leap from traditional economics into behavioral and psychological territory?
In order to understand this leap, you have to consider economics normally, typically, consider two phases of personality of an individual. This is the risk aversion, the level of risk aversion, and the intertemporal preferences, how much you like the future respect to the present, how much you are impatient. Okay, these are the two typical traits of the Homo economicus. Okay, now clearly psychology has a much more rich picture of human being. If you take, for example, the big five tier of personality, you will add to these two traits other five traits of personality, like openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Okay, so instead of considering an individual with 2 dimensions, you consider an individual with 7 dimensions. Everything become more complex. So how I did this? Well, I guess I started to think, I start to like more complexity in a sense. I was more fascinated by complexity. That's why I thought the obvious way was adding more dimensions to the analysis.
Professor, the COVID-19 pandemic gave you a rare natural experiment. What surprised you most about how personality traits like openness and neuroticism predicted people's mental health responses during lockdowns?
Okay, first of all, pandemic effectively gave a very natural experiment. You put people in a very unusual situation. Often they were constrained to live in a restricted spaces and with an environment which was a bit threatening, a bit more difficult, at least the way it was perceived. So that's clearly an experiment. This is an environment where it's interesting to see how people react. Huh? and personality were important in this respect, because different people react differently. Okay, so, and that's why it was interesting to see how personality was affecting this reaction. And the obvious thing to do was to analyze how personality affected people mental health, because that was the main outcome, no, on this kind of a very unpleasant situation. So indeed, both openness and neuroticism, openness was a strong predictor of mental health deterioration, and this is in a way obvious if you think about. People are open, have a taste for new experiences. Clearly, in a constrained environment, they felt particularly bad on this respect. But the interesting bit of this was the lack of effect of neurotic on more neurotic people. In a sense, you would have intuitively you would have expected, okay, more neurotic people, they get even worse in a very threatening environment. I mean, in fact, both using the British data and then the Chinese data, what we found was that neurotic people have very little effect. I mean, are affected not more than less neurotic people, okay? And this is counterintuitive. And why this happens? Well, a possibility is that neurotic people are already people who are expecting the worst to happen. They have already built their own tools to counteract this situation. So when this came, it was simply a job as usual in a way. Okay, I'm not saying the neurotic people were better off during the pandemic. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is where neurotic people were not worse off or less neurotic people, if I made myself clear.
Professor compared pandemic responses across the UK and China, two very different cultural contexts. Where did personality effect hold up universally, and where did culture override individual traits?
Well, by and large, the effects were similar, okay, both in China and in the UK, despite the fact we are talking about two completely different realities, different countries, for culture, for sides, for you name it. Now, in my view, should make happy psychologists, because psychologists have always posited that personality are mostly culturally independent. Okay, they are traits that are generated, determined by our evolution, but are more or less independent from the cultural situation where they live. So that was in a sense surprising, but at the same time comforting, because it's telling us effective personality traits seem to be what psychologists think they are, something which are inside us, are determining our behavior. Perhaps also they have some genetic roots, but they are largely independent than their culture where people live in. Yeah.
Professor, we often think of workplace productivity as driven by skills and incentives. How does your research reframe that? What do emotions and stress actually do to economic performance?
Well, I think it's obvious to say that emotions and stress affect performances, okay? So I don't think there is big surprising in saying something like that. The only surprising things in this respect is that, in my view, economists pay too little attention to this element. That's probably the most surprising part. Yeah, this is exactly the point. clearly, we have to be careful here, okay? It's much less predictable, the effect, than what can be an incentive, okay? If an individual get more money, you could pause it, and more or less you are right to say, okay, this person is more involved. Sorry, is more focused. It will work harder. Okay, but when you bring in into emotions and stress, things become much more complicated. For example, I'll give you an example. Take happiness. Okay, so one of my previous research now, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, showed that, hey, people are more energized and they tend to be better in doing some simple recurring task. Okay. However, this is an argument which you have to be very careful. It goes linearly forever. So the more happy you make, the more people the happier people become, the more productive they are. Well, I'm not sure about that. It might be that in a situation where everybody's, very, very excited, very, too, excited, they get distracted perhaps, and they get less focused on what they are doing, and then they become less productive. Same thing for stress. Okay, so think about stress. There is a level of stress, little bit perhaps, which is good, because it allows you to be more focused, more concentrated. But when you take this too much, people are too stressed, it's unlikely they are more productive. They tend to get sick, they tend to get, there are a lot of negative side. So in a way, what these things, they are important, but they are also more complicated to analyze, okay? So it generates dynamics which are difficult to predict.
Professor, standard economic models assume people behave rationally in strategic situations. How does individual intelligence challenge or disrupt that assumption in practice?
Okay, individual intelligence on one side make people more rational in the sense that they are better maximizing their own surplus. And that's the typical individual rationality. So more intelligent are closer to what an economist considers rational. But it goes more than that. So in my experiments, we found that individual intelligence is not only in surplus maximizer, but sometimes they have good externality on other people less intelligent. They sort of have an effect. They realize in a way that you cannot only, if you want to be better off, you don't only have to maximize your own surplus, but you have to teach the other how to maximize their surplus. So give us a way, okay? Constrain the other, even punishing the others or rewarding the others. You see, they start to be a bit like teachers in an environment. So that's why intelligence is interesting, because you see, it's not only maximizing your surplus, but also act as a way of trying also to change others people's behavior in the right way, in a sense, okay? This not because, okay, this, be careful, this is not because more intelligent people are more altruistic, no. They are even more individualistic, but they understand that their own surplus is maximized not only by maximizing their own surplus as an individual, but trying to also to bring the other people in a situation where they could also themselves do better. Okay, so I think this is intelligence is a very interesting, is an extremely interesting quality, because it allows really to make a difference, if you want, also, and give good externalities to people you are around.
Professor, we have found that cognitive ability shapes how people read others and form beliefs under uncertainty. Can you walk us through a striking example from your experimental work?
We have to be careful here too, because cognitive ability is not one, but are several cognitive abilities, okay? And there are factors. For example, one cognitive ability is capacity of solving abstract problem, which is what we normally think of intelligence. But a cognitive ability is also the understanding of emotions. Your emotions, my emotions, both. That's a quality, that's a cognitive skills, okay? You might have people who are extremely good at solving problem, but extremely bad at understanding people emotion. On the contrary, you can have people are very good at understanding the others' emotions, but are extremely limited when it's about solving problems. Okay, so this is an important element. Perhaps this element of capacity of mentalizing, or what normally economists are economists have been talking recently about theory of mind, okay, capacity of mentalizing the other. It's something which is less people are less aware of, but it's a facet of our intelligence, okay? So probably this is the interesting part, what was striking, that some people are good at guessing other people's beliefs, okay? So, and some people are good at solving the problem, but are very bad at guessing other people's beliefs, okay? So there is complexity, okay, even in the cognitive skills.
Professor, the rational voter model has long dominated political science. What does your evidence tell us about how cognitive ability and emotional states actually drive voting decisions?
Okay, now, you know, the rational voter is extremely demanding. Ask people are not only informed about everything around, but also able to predict direct effect, indirect effect, indirect of indirect effect, and so on. So if you think the complexity of any policy, let's talk about policy, for example. Any policy has several effects, a ripple effect, affect the economy of the society in different, more indirect way. Okay, the rational voter assume that people are able to predict all this way. Okay, it's extremely demanding. And in our research, we found that this capacity of predicting indirect effect is something that not everybody is able to do. You need an IQ particularly high to be able to predict indirect effect. Clearly, this has a cost, right? Has a cost in terms of political decision making, because very often there are policies which might be beneficial, but the effect is very difficult to understand. And this is a policy which are difficult to pass through the electorate to be. So in a sense, we see there are two elements here. First of all, say, okay, fine, you need to try maybe to select policies which are more simple to understand, which might not be the best. The second is a policymaker should be aware that he or she need to be very clear when and very convincing when it's about explaining the effect of policies, because we cannot give this for granted.
Professor, does your research suggest that emotional state on election day, a temporary condition, can meaningfully shift voting behavior in ways that have lasting consequences?
Yes, absolutely. I think that mood affect voting behavior is part of our voting decision. Is an emotional decision. It's not an emission, a decision which is rational. Also for the reason I said before. So very often we vote along partisan lines or emotional lines. We are upset, we are angry, we are. These are all effects that have a huge impact on casting the ballot. Okay, so this is clearly a fact. And again, this need to be taken seriously, okay, for the working of the democratic institutions that we all agree we need to be preserved. It's a big conquest, of the society, the democracy, and need to be preserved. But we need to consider the fact that emotions play a role, and emotions have can change, can decide who is going to win, is going to lose, and therefore have very lasting consequences on the economy of the total and the entire society. Clearly, yes.
Professor, if personality, intelligence, and emotions are fundamental economic drivers, what does that mean for how organizations should design workplaces or how government should design public policy?
Well, it's a very wide question, and it's very difficult to answer this question. Let's focus on something more specific. Let's take relationship between happiness and productivity, okay? So organizations should take into account that people's mood affect people productivity, and should organize the work accordingly, okay? So this is I think is an important thing to take into account. Obviously, we have to be careful, okay, in these things. We cannot push this argument too far, like I said before. A completely elated mood is not, I don't think it leads to more productivity, it leads to more distraction perhaps. It could also generate conflict in a way between people. So yes, if you are a manager, if you're a good manager, you need to consider people's mood. You need to consider that bad mood is not good for productivity. You need to consider that relationship between employees are important, because a bad relation can generate bad mood. On the contrary, good relationship may have a very good elastic positive effect. So you need to be careful about the state, the mood of the people you work, your line managing, and the way their interactions between them. So these are all elements that enter in the equations if you want to maximize their own productivity. And obviously, this is not easy. This is very complicated. We are at the beginning of this sort of studies. We don't have a clear understanding of all this complicated element and effect. But I think yes, we need the idea that mood or well-being, if you want, even more than mood, of your employees are part of your job as a manager. This is an important element to take into account. Definitely, yes, it is. Another thing is important. We have we have as a human being, no, tendency to get too much, to take things too much to an extreme. Okay. So at some point, I understood this idea of well-being and productivity that actually, if you want, was started of our paper on Journal of Labor Economics, started to generate a lot of debate, the institution of the happiness manager, almost like a sort of idea that people should be forced to be happy. Okay, well, that's wrong. that's simply wrong. It's a bad way of interpreting this. You cannot force people to be happy. You cannot generate expectation that you have to be happy all the time. That it doesn't work. It doesn't have the effect you want them to work. Okay, so we need to be careful how we interpret this idea. Okay, in everything we need to be measured and that.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. What's the most uncomfortable or counterintuitive findings in your research? Something that challenge even your own assumptions going in.
Well, you know what is the most uncomfortable finding of, I wouldn't call counterintuitive though, but I'm uncomfortable, is that if you start to consider elements like personalities, emotions, all this psychological element, you have to live with the fact that human being is complex in everything, all the models, all the model interpreting will only tell you a part of the story, okay? So you have to live with the fact that you cannot have a model for everything, a behavioral model for everything. No, forget about that. It's too complicated, our behavior, and it depends on so many elements that interact each other, interact with the environment, that if any model for the best model that you can get will only tells you a part of the history, okay? And you have to live with that. That part of the story, and you have to live with that, okay? That's perhaps uncomfortable. You are maybe you live in an academic environment where you, in a way, you're led to think, okay, fine, I'll generate a model that explain everything, or give a good explanation of everything. And then you go there, you go look at the data, you say, okay, fine, this model gives some explanation, okay? There is something which is significant, but it's part of the story. There is a lot of it which is unexplained. And then you have to live with that, okay? That could be frustrating at some time, but it's part of our humanity, this complexity. And we cannot force it, because if we force this humanity into some specific model, we first of all, we don't serve the truth. Second, it's wrong. I mean, it's simply wrong.
Professor Eugenio Proto, this conversation has been truly eye-opening. You have shown us that the forces shaping our economic lives aren't just market conditions or policy frameworks. They live inside us, in our personalities, our intelligence, and our emotional states. There's a profound shift in how we think about everything from workplace design to democratic participation. Thank you for bringing such rigorous research, yet accessible to our audience today. For our listeners, I hope this episode leaves you reflecting on the hidden drivers behind your own decisions and perhaps seeing economics in a whole new light. Until next time, keep thinking deeper. Thank you once again, Professor Eugenio, for sharing your fascinating research with our audience. It has been an absolute privilege to having you on Business Talk. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.